You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome to WCAT Radio. I'm Dr. Kristina Olsen. I have as my guest here today Father Paul Pearson, and we're going to be talking about his recent books that were published by TAN St. Benedict's Press on spiritual direction using Dante and the Divine Comedy as a source and as a resource for spiritual direction. Just to mention the titles of the books that we'll be talking about, there are 3 volumes. The first is Spiritual Direction from Dante, Avoiding the Inferno. The second is Spiritual Direction from Dante, Ascending Mount Purgatory. And the third is Spiritual Direction from Dante, Yearning for Paradise. So now, without waiting any longer, I'd like to introduce Father Paul Pearson. And Father
Thank
Paul,
you.
welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, we love to hear about these books. I know Dante is a subject of interest and of curiosity, and sometimes a little fear when we talk about the Inferno. So we'll be glad to have you guide us through this. Would you like to tell us a little bit about how these books came to be?
Certainly. I teach in the seminary, and I've been teaching now for 39 years. It's hard. It's sort of makes me tremble to say that. But for 39 years, I've been teaching seminarians, and it became clear to me when I was teaching them about meditation that many of them had difficulty handling a text like Scripture and being able to draw meaning from it for their own prayer, which sent off alarm bells in my head. If they can't come up with things to meditate about, they'll never come up with things to preach about. So I thought, really, I need to get them more comfortable looking at a text that deals with metaphor, that has parables, that has types, and it isn't just all straightforward historical narrative. And so I said, well, how do I do this? And I'm a medievalist, and I had studied here at the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies here in Toronto, and I did my master's thesis on Dante. And I thought, well, Dante consciously writes in the style of Scripture. He tries to write on the 4 levels of Scripture that we learn, the literary and then the 3 spiritual meanings. He's conscious of trying to mimic that. Perhaps it's not the most humble thing to do, but he tries to write like God writes. And so I thought, well, this would be sort of interesting. So without telling them that Dante was poetry, because I thought that might scare them off, we started reading the Inferno. And what we did was we just read a little bit of the Inferno, just a couple lines at a time. And then we'd stop and comment on them. And this style of reading and commenting, which is inspired by the founder of my community, St. Philip Neri, which he used to call speaking on the book.
Oh.
So he would take spiritual books and like the lives of saints, and he'd read just a little bit. And once he got to something that was worth chewing on, he'd stop. Okay. And he'd begin to explain and expound that and make it more accessible to his hearers until he thought that it was well established in their hearts. And then he would move on to the next chunk. And this is the way that he would do things. And so I thought, well, this would be a nice bringing together of my Oratorian tradition and my medievalist training and what the seminarians seem to need. So we experimented with Dante, and they were fascinated by it. One of them says, this is like poetry for guys. I thought that was not a bad idea. It was very heroic and very theological, but on its own, it could be a little intimidating. There's a lot of mythology, there's a lot of theology, there's a lot of Florentine history. And if you put all of that together, it can be a little overwhelming to a modern reader. And so many of the good translations of Dante, and I've used many over the decades. The one I'm using right now is Anthony Eslin's excellent series on the Divine Comedy. This is the Paradise one. I'll be thinking more about this one today.
Okay.
His is the one I've used, but I've also used the wonderful versions by John Sinclair from Oxford University Press and Alan Mandelbaum as well. I like those very much. But so we started reading the text, and they became fascinated with it. And when we finished, at the end of it, it took us a whole semester to go through just the Inferno. We just took our time and read it all aloud.
Wow. Okay.
There's something too about listening to great literature and hearing it not just seeing it.
Yes.
And I think that we, in the modern world, because we just read with our eyes, unlike in the Middle Ages and the ancient world, where they almost always read aloud.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
And so for them, they'd be using their eyes and their ears, and two parts of their brain would be engaging with the text. And I think there's something very important about that sort of neurologically too. So I decided we're just reading aloud. And that worked very, very well. And they became fascinated with the subject and quickly demanded that we do Purgatory in the next semester. And so this became a sort of seminary fascination with Dante. And so that started in 1990.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so I've been doing this for a long time. And after a while, I started writing down my reflections and my commentaries on this until about 2015, when I started thinking about it more seriously. And finally, I talked to the people at Tan Books, and they were fascinated by the idea, so long as I would do the whole thing and not just Inferno.
Oh.
And I said that was fine. I was willing to do that.
That's
because
wonderful.
I think often people do get stuck in the Inferno because it's so dramatic and so horrifying in many ways. But I think for most serious followers of Christ, and certainly most practicing Catholics, the most important of these books is Purgatorio and Paradiso, because Purgatorio is sort of where we are right now. And trying to fight through that, all the leftover muck in our lives, and to clean up our act.
Yes.
And Paradise is where we're supposed to be headed. So those two, I think, need extra emphasis, because they don't have all the drama of Inferno, but they really are more important for us in our everyday lives as practicing Catholics. So I wanted to make sure we got through all three. This has also been the 700th anniversary of Dante's death. And so these books were actually published in 19, 20, and 22. And 20 was the actual publication date, and 21 was the death of Dante. So we just had we're coming up to the 701st anniversary of his death.
Sure.
So it all fit in actually by Providence, not by me, with this anniversary as well. So, but the purpose of the text then is to try to help people almost eavesdrop on this class, where they can read just little bits of Dante at a time so that it won't be intimidating, and then take part in this discussion. But I realized that even that was a little bit overwhelming, that I had to get their minds on track. So what I do is, before we begin a section of Dante, I give a little reflection, what one of my seminarians called the spiritual blurbs.
Okay, that's good.
Just something which is not based upon Dante, just a reflection of our own lives, and raises a few spiritual issues or questions. And then, with our minds alive to these issues, we then read Dante in order to address those issues. So there's a little introductory paragraph or so that will sort of get us on track. And then we go a few lines, and every few lines there'll be a comment that will explain what Dante is talking about. Dante's work is enumerated by line numbers, and my commentary follows those line numbers. And whatever translation you're using, they'll have the line numbers in it, so you can follow regardless of what translation you're using.
Well, that's great. That's a wonderful history. It sounds like it's really been helpful to the seminarians and very useful. And that Dante, for me, it does seem to need a little bit of interpretation.
Yes.
So it's great. It is foreign maybe to our modern ear, at least to mine. And it's great also to have, I'll call it the podcast style. What we're doing here today is not unlike what you described being so helpful to the seminarians in terms of, if we were to read some and then talk about it, and have that primary mode of learning be listening if it's a podcast. And I'm wondering if maybe that's why podcasts are getting more popular these days, because it is really great to be able to sit back and even walk around your house or whatever and have that podcast on. I know Father Mike Schmitz's Bible in a Year podcast is very popular, and so they can be some very helpful and uplifting things that we do. But again, just going back to the listening, the oral AURAL, the oral mode of hearing and pondering and reflecting on a text is just wonderful. So you mentioned, that it's bold text. It's a bold piece of writing, and I know we're going to want to ask you to give us an example of how you approach this in a moment. But just for a moment before that, I wonder if you could connect this for us to perhaps some other bold legends and writings that might be similar to Dante, perhaps from that era or maybe even earlier.
Sure. I mean, Dante sees himself as the successor of two people in particular.
Okay.
Virgil, who is his guide for 2/3 of the Divine Comedy, and St. Paul, because both of these were given special visions of life after death. And so he sees himself as being brought into this very distinguished company. Virgil was given this, and in his Aeneid, Aeneas was taken into the underworld, and he was given a chance to see what was actually there. And this glimpse that Virgil gave of life after death, and also his writings about the possibility of a virgin conceiving and bearing a son, made Christians look upon Virgil as a sort of proto-gospel in just a couple generations before the time of Christ. And so that early Christians would sometimes almost superstitiously decide what they were going to do based upon cutting Virgil, putting a card in Virgil and finding the opening and saying what was on that page.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
They really did see him as being specially inspired by God. And of course, St. Paul with his, I know a man who went up into the heavens.
Yes.
And so this idea that somehow Dante was given this gift, a scary gift, but a gift nonetheless, of seeing the afterlife. Now, this was a gift that he didn't take upon himself, but he makes it very clear in the first couple cantos of Inferno that this is something designed by heaven, that heaven saw, and in particular the Blessed Virgin Mary saw, that he was getting off track, seriously off track in his life. And he had gone past a point where he could get back on track himself. So the Blessed Virgin motions to St. Lucy and says, Lucy, here's a guy who has you as a special patron. He's in a bad way. What are we going to do? Lucy says, he has a friend named Beatrice. I'm going to get Beatrice. And so Beatrice, Lucy, and the Blessed Virgin come up with a plan. They're going to grab hold of Dante and take him on a tour of the afterlife. They're going to drag him through hell, and they're going to literally scare the hell out of him. And then they're going to make him climb Mount Purgatory, and they're going to give him a view of heaven.
Wow.
And afterwards, they hope that this is going to change him. And as St. Peter tells, it says Dante in Paradise, they want Dante to go back home and become a missionary of hope for the people around him.
So are we saying here that Dante himself, the person, did in fact have this experience, or are we...
Dante writes as though this is the case.
Okay, good enough.
Dante writes as though this is the case.
I see.
He's a bodily person who goes on this trip through the underworld, up Mount Purgatory, and up into heaven. He then comes back at the end to bring this message back to Earth.
Okay. I can't help but think of people who've had near-death experiences and how, this happens. So
right now, this is a big deal, isn't it? So I think that Dante, for that reason, people see Dante as being this very prophetic figure. And the fact that he has such amazing theological precision and also a shocking psychological insight. I was talking to a directee of mine who was a psychiatrist. And when I was talking to him about Dante's view of suicide, he said, I've never heard anybody outside of the 20th century describe suicide so accurately.
Wow.
The suicides are in the form of trees, and Dante plucks off a branch, and when he plucks off the branch bleeds.
Oh.
And it's only when they're bleeding that they can speak.
Oh,
that their only way of communicating is through their suffering.
Oh.
And which is so sad. but it's also so accurate.
So yes, well, people, that serious depression leading to suicide. I mean, honestly, I don't know enough about it, but I mean, it sounds fascinating that the psychiatrist would say that. And my thoughts as you were speaking were simply the idea, which you may want to touch on, of the contrapasso, where the punishments for hell so fit where the people are psychologically, whether it's gluttony or whatever type of sin it is.
Yes, indeed.
To me, that was like the most astounding thing I found in Dante when I read it. But let's not forget to ask you to go ahead and give readers a little sense of what they will encounter and how you intend for them to use your books.
So I've chosen a little section from Paradise, the third of the three canticles. And in the very first canto, each one of these volumes is divided into what he calls songs or cantos. And each one, except for the first one, has an introductory canto, and then each one has 33. So it adds up to 100, 33 for the years of Christ's life. And so we're in Canto 1 of Paradise. And he's just had his first view of Paradise. And he notices this almost magnetic attraction he feels towards heaven. But in another sense, that magnetic attraction doesn't really take off in the way that he expects it to. So this is the reflection I give leading up to this section. Our spiritual life is a tug of war. God is drawing us towards him, and we are doing our best to escape his loving embrace. C.S. Lewis captured this sad drama in his wonderful book, The Great Divorce. He describes a blessed soul who has come trying to convince her complaining husband, a dwarf ghost, to let go of his grievances and enter into heavenly joy. She tries every tactic she can, approaches him from different points of view, and even attempts to use humor to shake him out of his stubborn rejection of God's grace. Watching this exchange, the narrator says, "I do not know that I ever saw anything more terrible than the struggle of that dwarf ghost against joy." But the angels and saints watch similar dramas unfolding every day. We are being called to joy, drawn by the power of God's grace, cajoled by the words of the gospel, encouraged by the example of the saints. God works for our salvation, and we avoid it. Where are we running? What are we avoiding? The real wonder is not that we are saved. God's intervention makes that possible, but that we want to turn away from infinite joy. So the text from Dante, as he begins to experience this, reads like this. "And to that place, as to our destined sight, we speeded by the power of that cord, shooting each arrow in its happy flight." He compares the soul to an arrow coming off the string of a bow. My comment is, we're speeded by the power of that cord, shooting each arrow in its happy flight. As an arrow is propelled by the bowstring to fly towards its target, our soul shoots towards heaven. That propulsion is the consequence of our human nature under the influence of God's grace. We are being drawn to God. As Christ told his followers, "No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him." And he does draw us. His grace is available in almost foolish abundance. And yet somehow we manage to avoid it, to sidestep his embrace, and even pull back because the matter's deaf and won't respond. Back to Dante. Often it's true a form may not accord with the intent of him who works the art, because the matter's deaf and won't respond. So from this course, a creature may depart if it should have the power, despite the push, to swerve away and veer off from its start. And you'll see a fall of lightning flash from the high clouds. So cheating pleasures skew that first urge, and they plunge it to earth. The comment reads, The mystery of human freedom, especially when that freedom seems to be our own worst enemy, lies at the core of Beatrice's words. She's Dante's guide in Paradise. A creature may depart if it should have the power, despite the push, to swerve away and veer off from its start. We cannot make heaven happen, but we can escape from it. Our fearfulness of even approaching the subject of heaven surely comes from our own feelings of unworthiness, of the whole project of holiness being beyond us. We think we are just not the sort of people to become saints. We cannot do it. But heaven is what God intended for us from the beginning. It's a natural movement. It's perfectly normal. As Dante said, but it would be a cause of just surprise if, free of every bar, you should remain like a still flame on earth and not arise. Holiness is normal. Sin and its horrible consequences are truly unnatural and freakish.
Well, if that doesn't draw one toward heaven, I don't know what would. I mean, it's very, very convincing, and yet who hasn't experienced that sort of shying away? It's like, I don't know if I'm ready to be this close to God. I mean, he knows every intimate detail of my thoughts, and that's a little bit, oh my goodness, I'm not alone, which is what we want.
Yes.
But on the other hand, it's not exactly an invasion of privacy, but something like that.
We always recognize that coming closer to God means leaving something behind.
That's true also.
And those little attachments, even if they're not necessarily sinful, that we've sort of defined ourselves by. It's a matter of letting those go. And there's always this price to be paid for moving closer. And I think we know that interiorly, even if we don't think about it actually in our minds. If we're not being verbal about it, we still have an instinct of it, that this is going to require something of me.
So in Dante's journey, would you say that he gets ever better at detachment? Would you say that that's what happens?
He does.
Him?
He does.
Okay.
When he first looks back at Earth from heaven, the first thing he does is he goes and looks for Italy. And he figures out where Florence is.
Yeah.
And he thinks about his home. And he's still defining himself as this Florentine who's far away. But as he gets higher and higher in heaven, and he's worked on this detachment, and the saints there have worked on his detachment too. They're always working for him. It's very interesting to see how hard they work for his salvation. He looks back again. And this time he says, what looked so important to me before now seems like a small speck. And he turned his back on it and kept walking.
Wow, what spiritual growth. And as you mentioned that, looking for Florence, I wonder if our listeners would know about Dante's own experience of being exiled from Florence.
That's right.
That would have perhaps, does that play into how he writes this part of the Paradise?
It does indeed.
No.
It does. Yes,
it does. Okay.
Yeah. Dante suffered this enormous disappointment in his life. He was very involved with politics. There were the Guelphs and the Ghibellines fighting, and the Guelphs had basically won. But then the Guelphs divided into those who supported the emperor more and those who supported the pope more, and the white and the black Guelphs. And the other side won. Dante had gone to Rome to petition the pope for various things. And while he was away, his side lost, and he was exiled and was never allowed to return. There's a death sentence against him. He never returned. And all his possessions were confiscated. His property was lost. And so he basically ended up staying with friends for the rest of his life.
Wow.
When he was getting close to death and he was becoming more and more famous, he swore, my body is not going back to Florence.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
I don't want them to profit from me.
Yeah.
There's a tomb in Santa Croce in Florence that says Dante on it. It's just an empty box.
It's
Dante,
not. Okay.
Dante's
He's not
buried
there.
He's buried in Ravenna.
Oh, is he?
Yeah.
But as a landowner in that era, that would be a huge deal, right?
Huge.
So, yeah.
He was so angry, and his first instinct was to get revenge. And so Dante recognizes that there were three things his three beasts, as it comes up in the beginning of the Inferno, that were keeping him from holiness. The first and the most obvious one was a leopard. It stood for lust. Well, he's a guy. What can we say? And the second one was a lion, and that lion seems to stand for pride, or maybe anger. Well, anger and pride go together pretty closely. And the third one, and the one that seemed to be most persistent, was the wolf. The wolf stood for avarice. He'd lost all his goods, and he wanted to get them back. And he was willing to do whatever it took to reestablish his lifestyle.
Sure, it seems unjust. Now, in your order, the Saint Philip Neri oratory.
Yes, that's
okay.
Right. The oratory of Saint Philip Neri.
Oratory of Saint Philip Neri. Would the seminarians be able to relate to the giving up of goods, the choice of voluntary poverty, or I don't know much about the order. I know other orders do renounce goods.
Yeah. Our order, we're not technically an order, we're just a group of priests living together. We're sort of institute of religious life.
Gotcha.
So we don't have vows. And our seminary is something we actually run for diocesan seminarians and for members of other religious orders. So we have a huge variety of people, from diocesan seminarians to people who are living the three vows of poverty, chastity, obedience. So there would be a large diversity of that. But certainly I think anybody who's called to a life of ministry, whether he has a vow of poverty or not, certainly is called to a life of simplicity.
Yes.
And there's a lot of other things you leave behind.
Yes, and let's remind our readers again of the titles of your books. So there are 3 volumes: Spiritual Direction from Dante, and the subtitles of them are Volume 1, Avoiding the Inferno, Volume 2, Ascending Mount Purgatory, and Volume 3, Yearning for Paradise by Father Paul Pearson, published by Tan St. Benedict's Press. And we're going to keep going with the interview, but I'm just curious.
This is the third volume, the one I was just reading from.
Oh, wonderful! Looks like a beautiful volume, very well designed, and everything looks very.
You see it starts off with Inferno being black, Purgatory being gray, and finally we get to the white of paradise. So.
Oh, that's great. That's good symbolism.
Yeah.
And these are available also on Amazon as well as
they certainly are.
Okay, that's good to know, Father Pearson.
Yeah.
So we were talking a little bit about poverty and letting go of things, and I'm fascinated by how you describe and how you demonstrated your approach in the books. So how do the seminarians relate to, if there's such a diversity of the readership that you've worked with so far, relate to Dante's quest? We're talking about poverty right now. I guess that would be the one thing, letting go of things and detachment. Is that a pretty universal quest for everyone, would you say?
Well, I think all of these, are things that we're called as Christians to do at different levels. I mean, even if we're lay people, we still are called to live this life that Christ asks us to live, a life in which we're detached from the things of this world, because we're called to be citizens of heaven. And so that's going to be a different sort of detachment for a married person raising a family from me as a priest who lives in a community. I can be much freer with my goods. It'd be irresponsible for a father to, give away everything. But I can do more of that. But it's a call for everybody to live in this world, but not be part of the world. Not to be so tied down by this world, as Dante was saying, that the natural motion up towards heaven is weighed down.
Yes. So would you say people of all types would benefit from the spiritual direction side that you offer in these books?
This is intended for everyday Christians.
Okay.
I know my family member, I'm a convert. My family members who are not Catholics have read it, and they're making their way through Paradiso right now. And so they've made through the first 2 volumes. And my everyday parishioners, many of whom have English as a second language, are reading it as well. So, and it's been being used by a bunch of different parishes in the area, because my former seminarians are parish priests now. Their reading groups in their parishes are reading these books, and which is really quite interesting. So I know of about half a dozen groups in the area who are using this as a group reading.
I mean, I wouldn't pick Dante as the most popular group reading topic necessarily. So you must have done, a wonderful job of making it relevant to the modern reader, to the contemporary reader. The excerpt that you shared with us certainly did a great job of that. Are there, I'm wondering about the classics. Since there's reference to Virgil and reference to other, I think Cicero too, perhaps, other classical authors.
A little bit. There's a lot more mythology.
A lot more mythology. And so is Medusa in there?
Medusa, she certainly is.
So
with the snakes and everything.
Yes. And some of these references, not being as familiar with mythology other than what little I am familiar with. There might be other people like me who aren't as familiar with these, I don't know if we should say ancient, but early authors,
right,
and their style of writing.
Yeah.
Is that how do you bridge that gap for us?
I do.
Good.
If something is important for the spiritual meaning of the text, then I will explain it. If it's something that is there for Dante's more literary or historical points, then I tend to gloss over it.
Okay.
You don't really need to figure out the ins and outs of Florentine politics to get something out of this book.
And I know there are some wonderful commentaries on Dante that do go into depth about the history. And
definitely.
It's fascinating if we're interested in history, and yet if we just want to sort of glean the spiritual benefit, we maybe don't need that right up front.
Dante's sort of, I think, been taken over by English departments.
Oh, okay.
And history departments. And
okay.
I think that wasn't his original intention. His intention was that this is supposed to be, as I said, a mission of hope. And he's supposed to be doing this to bring other people onto the pathway to holiness. So I think the spiritual interpretation of Dante is in keeping with his original intention, better than these historical and political interpretations. Well,
some of the names of the people he encounters evoke that very thing. For example, Beatrice, the beatific vision seems to come to mind, and of course St. Mary, St. Lucy, light. Blessed Virgin Mary always is a wonderful guide for our Christian lives. Could you comment on those three women and any others that come to mind that maybe we'd know that would be more familiar and less historically important?
There, especially when you get to Paradise, it's just a who's who of the saints.
Oh, okay.
And we're guided through different circles by different saints. St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Bonaventure take us through the circle of the theologians. We meet King David. We meet the Emperor Justinian. We have everyday people in the early cantos, just to show us that this is not just a fancy person thing. And we meet St. John and St. Peter and St. up in the top. It's really quite something. And so, but Beatrice is one of my favorites, and the seminarians know this. And so now I've been given.
Look, that's beautiful,
isn't it? It's really
yes.
So
this is that marble?
Yes, it is. Yeah. So this sits on my shelf here.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. So she's looking down on me all the time. So
that's great.
The idea here is a lovely idea, because I think often in the modern world we view ourselves as living out our spiritual lives in ultimate isolation. That it's between us and God. And I grew up with this idea because I grew up as a evangelical Protestant, and this idea that religion is fundamentally a personal thing between me and God is, of course, true at one level. It requires me to engage with God and to make this personal choice. But it's not only that. And the idea that somehow there's this divine conspiracy going on in Dante's favor, and that people are scheming for him without his even knowing it, which is so lovely.
And the communion of saints. I mean, that's a Catholic idea that's been.
And I think we don't really live that now. We don't really live that in the same intensity. There's a lovely moment when Dante's climbing Mount Purgatory, when there's an earthquake, at least what he thinks is an earthquake. And he says, "Oh, wait a second. I was told that there was no bad weather or nothing like that in Purgatory. So what's this earthquake?" And so he finally asked somebody, "What was the earthquake?" It wasn't an earthquake. one of the souls had finished his purgation and was ready to go up to heaven.
Wow.
And all the souls stopped and sang.
Oh,
Everybody joined together in the celebration for this one soul.
that is so wonderful. It just makes me, for some reason, think about there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. There's one scripture in the Bible, which is not the same situation at all, but just the fact that all of heaven could be united and pause and, turn all of heaven's gaze on one soul. The other scripture that comes to mind is there's more rejoicing over, one sinner has repented. Yeah. Then going out, the lost sheep parable and so forth. So that's a beautiful picture, word picture that you painted for us.
And Dante's constantly drawing on these scriptural things. In the Middle Ages, most educated people would have had the Gospels and large chunks of the Psalms, most of the Psalms, and probably even some of the Acts of the Apostles and maybe the letters of St. Paul basically memorized.
Oh, okay.
And so since books were very expensive, a bound volume of a book that would be like this size would be about the cost of a mid-sized car.
Oh my goodness. Now they would have been in Latin and there wouldn't have been much white space, right? It's just dense Latin, I think, in those early.
Most of the time they would have been manuscripts.
Okay.
And they would have been handwritten on parchment, which means you had to kill a flock of sheep in order for this to happen before paper was really done. Dante is one of the first authors to write in Italian.
Oh, he wrote in Italian.
He wrote in Italian. In fact, Dante is sort of almost the founder of literary Italian.
Oh.
If you put together the importance of Shakespeare and Chaucer and put them together into one, you get the importance of Dante for the Italian language.
So St. Francis would have lived, around the same time?
A
little before.
He's mainly a century before.
A century before, and he was considered the father of, I think, songs written in Italian, one of the first. Right. Yeah.
That's right.
So this is just the vernacular language sort of coming into its own in literature and in music.
So you have Dante and then people like Boccaccio, and so really this is the beginning of the Italian Renaissance, where they begin to turn to the vernacular as a language to be used not just for everyday marketplace stuff, but also for literature. And so Dante's Italian is probably a little bit closer to medieval Latin than it is to Italian. I've had many Italian students in my classes, and I'll ask them to read, and they say, "Oh, please don't ask me to read. It's so hard." and one of them actually said that when he was reading Dante's text, he was reading it in English because he found it easier than reading it in the Old Italian.
Certainly Old English and contemporary English, and then Old Spanish, which I'm more familiar with, and contemporary Spanish are so different. Anyway, so that does sort of make sense. Now, would you say that then I think we've said that non-Catholics and Catholics alike would benefit from this approach to spiritual direction? Yes. Would you agree?
I think that's very true, because there are two main foundations for Dante. The first is scriptural. And so I think anybody with a scriptural basis would find this fascinating. One of the people I've done an interview with is a professor of scripture who teaches at evangelical Bible school in South Carolina. And it's so interesting to see somebody from a non-Catholic tradition be so fascinated with Dante. And well, they should be. He's an amazing interpreter of scripture. But I think there's Dante is also very in tune with the philosophy of human nature. And so I think that anybody who studies human nature honestly, whether you're a psychologist or a sociologist, will be fascinated by the way in which he views human interactions and the way he sees human perfection happening.
Well, my goodness, I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the structure of Dante's writing. You know, the Inferno and Purgatory and Heaven, and yet I just can't help but think of Purgatory again and the understanding of human nature. And you may, if you want to, you might want to mention a couple of the sort of salient sins that people might be interested in and how Dante describes them, because some of those graphic images are hard to get through, I think, but I wonder if you could also guide us in helping us understand, if we should read these books in order, these books of yours, which guide us through Dante, if they should be read in order, or if perhaps we should skip around. So structurally, what's happening here?
Well, I think if you think of Inferno as doing one main spiritual task, to make you see not what God will do to you if you sin. That's not really the point. The point is what sin is doing to you right now.
Oh.
That if you view the destructive power of sin inside the soul, and then that destructive power being projected out, almost like a hologram, that projection of the interior destruction of sin is what the punishments of hell really are. So Dante is trying to say, this is what's happening right now in your soul. And you, once you see it, should be horrified by it. You should be running, screaming away from sin. And so really, as often spiritual writers write, and people like Francis de Sales or Lorenzo Scupoli in his Spiritual Combat will write that the very first motion of spiritual conversion is a hatred of sin.
Hatred of sin and a vision of hell. Teresa of Avila had a vision of hell that really converted her, turned her.
Yeah, I think that sense, I can't do this anymore. This is dangerous. This is disgusting.
Yes.
I'm filled with revulsion at this. And that's what the Inferno is really about.
Okay.
It's not about necessarily scaring you, but it's about making you be disgusted with the things that you might be attached to.
And it's hard to break away from some of these attachments. I mean, that's many of our issues is letting go of the things that seem so pleasurable at the moment, but really have a destructive quality about them. And I mean, isn't there one section of hell where people are arguing with each other and they're so attached to this interaction with each other that they don't know anything else around them? And
the people who are fighting down, the fraudulent people who are fighting with each other and they're just punching each other madly. We have another group up, the wrathful, who are in the river and are just ripping each other to pieces, overwhelmed by their destructive power. But purgatory is sort of different. And here, the punishments here, although they're still horrifying, are all the horror of rehab.
Okay.
If you've ever been through rehab, and I've been through it a couple times. If you've been through rehab, as my physiotherapist said, I'm sorry, ahead of time I apologize. This is going to hurt. And once you're twisted, and we recognize that sin really does twist us, to get us straight again is going to take some real work. And that work is going to go against the grain. And what you see in purgatory is the unraveling of sin.
Okay.
And so what we see then is, where are we when we're left with this leftover habit of sin, the stain of sin? What happens when I've repented of being proud, but that's still my reaction?
Well put.
Yeah, because you could repent and still have it.
Yeah, it can still come up in a moment when a car cuts us off or whatever it might be. So
no matter how long you've been working at these things,
sure,
your personality is still there.
Yeah.
And your habits are still seeds that are planted there. So how do I deal with all of that? How do I rehab from that ultimate spiritual scar tissue? And that's what Purgatorio is about.
Okay.
But see, Purgatorio is still on the way then. It's about what I need to do to purify myself and to get my full freedom of movement back spiritually. But it's not yet about what heaven is. Heaven isn't just about getting back to being the best version of myself. It's about seeing God. And all of these other things are just preliminaries to this overwhelming vision. And in the Divine Comedy, once you get into paradise, everything is focused on God. Dante has this moment when, almost in an act of vertigo, he recognizes that he's viewed the earth as being at the center and God being far away out in the distance. But when he gets further and further into heaven, he has this vision where he recognizes it's all inside out. And that, in fact, God is the center of everything. And this journey he thinks that's been going further and further out into heaven has been a journey to the center of things.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
So as we think about Dante's journey and his way of envisioning heaven, how, with your biblical understanding and your evangelical Protestant background, which I really appreciate the biblical knowledge of so many, evangelicals when they preach and everything, they really have a command of the Bible. So many of them do. Is there any sort of warning bell that should go off to say, well, now look, Dante's view is this, but the truth in the Catholic, in the Bible and in the Catholic tradition, magisterium of the Church, needs to be sort of tempered a little bit with what we know today about all of that?
Well, in general, I think Dante is very, very careful about following the best theology of his day. Some people have jokingly said that Dante is Thomas Aquinas in verse.
Okay.
And as a Thomist reading the Divine Comedy, I've always found that to be fairly true. There are some places where Dante, in order to give explanations, goes beyond what is in fact Catholic teaching.
Okay.
So, for example, he has a section that he calls the limbo of the pagans. And there he has babies around, because that was a traditional interpretation, never a dogma of the Church, that unbaptized children went to limbo. But he also puts the virtuous pagans there. And it's a place where he puts Virgil. And that's Dante's invention.
Okay.
But I think that when it comes to the basic teachings about the nature of sin, the things he considers sins, and the 7 levels of Mount Purgatory are in fact the 7 deadly sins. Pride, envy, wrath, and all this. And when I was reading Purgatorio again with the seminarians, it finally reached my head that the 7-Story Mountain by Thomas Merton was in fact Mount Purgatory.
Oh, okay. I've read that, but I didn't make that connection. Yeah,
well, it's perfectly possible not to. When he's talking about this growth up the mountain, his growth towards holiness, he's really talking about Mount Purgatory.
And the 7 deadly sins, that does make sense. And it'd be hard to read Dante without thinking of those. I mean, there's anger, there's lust, there's gluttony, they're all there.
Envy, and so he starts off with humility and pride, and contrary humility, as the first thing you have to get before you can do anything else. It's a lovely thing.
So many of our, Saint Bernard, so many of our saints have emphasized humility, as one of, if not the most important virtue.
If the original sin was in fact a sin of pride, then undoing sin has to go back to that source, doesn't it?
Sure.
Yeah.
So we can confidently and comfortably as Catholics read Dante and also read your reflections on spiritual direction and walk through it with you in text, where we only need to read a couple of lines. If the medieval style is a little too much for us and we want to go a little bit slowly, we can easily do that, it sounds like, with your approach to Dante.
That's right. So for example, this book here is 33 cantos, but each canto is divided up into 3, 4, or even 5 parts. And so you have 150 little sections in this. And reading one of those in a day will give you something, a little nugget to think about. And it might just be a page or a page and a half of reading. And I really think that that's the best way to read spiritual things. Because if we just read out of curiosity, we don't really chew on it. I think we just need to get enough to say, I get that. I feel how that hits me. Now I just need to go away and let it settle.
Yes, and skimming, this wouldn't be the type of book to skim at all.
No.
Not at all. And 150, so it's like maybe a year and a half would get you through all 30 books.
That's right.
About a couple of years.
Yeah.
So and then you go around again, I would think.
I've read these, many, many, many times. So
sure.
I never find them old.
Sure. Well, yes. I mean, it's all about our spiritual growth, and it's really seems like it's very fruitful for the spiritual life. And we've really gotten a sense of how you approach Dante and what the books are about. And let me repeat the titles again here. from Father Paul Pearson. We have Spiritual Direction from Dante, Avoiding the Inferno, Volume 1. Spiritual Direction from Dante, Ascending Mount Purgatory, Volume 2. Spiritual Direction from Dante, Yearning for Paradise, Volume 3, published by TAN, St. Benedict's Press, available from their website as well as on Amazon. And after our discussion here, I'm almost thinking a person could maybe start even with Volume 2, possibly.
You can, and many people have.
Okay.
Some people find, I think Volume 2 is certainly if you wanted reading for Lent, for example, that'd be a very helpful thing for Lent.
Sure.
But I do think that I give a little bit of a background in the introduction. I don't skip the introductions; they're fun.
Okay, good to know. Yeah.
The preface and introductions are there for a reason, and they're a lot of fun. So don't skip those. But they give a little bit of background so that you can start Purgatorio without Inferno. But I think once you've tasted it enough and gotten confident about it, you'll probably want to go back and start at the beginning.
Okay, sure. Well, that makes sense. And if you're going to read Dante, you're going to want to know what's in that Inferno, because it's such a basic foundation for people who study and talk about Dante. And yes. So, well, Father Paul, is there? I think our time is just about coming to a close here. Is there anything else you'd like to bring out? Any highlights that you would like people to go away with as they think about your 3 volumes here that we've been discussing?
Well, I think the main thing is to remember that so many people are introduced to Dante only by reading the Inferno. Mm-hmm. That's what you get in introductory text to the greats of Western classics. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a sort of disservice, because Dante is intended to be this journey, and the original interaction with hell and the punishments of hell is meant to be this thing that drives you up Mount Purgatory. And Mount Purgatory is supposed to be this thing that gradually enkindles in you this desire for something more. And in Paradise, we finally get that thing that is more. And so to read only the Inferno is a real disservice. The Inferno is wonderful and can include so many important things, but it's the first stage of a journey. Mm-hmm. And don't stop there. Read all 3.
Read all 3.
Yeah.
Okay, on that note, well, I'm Dr. Kristina Olsen from WCAT Radio, and we've been talking with Father Paul Pearson on his 3 books on spiritual direction with Dante, published by TAN, St. Benedict's Press. And so, Father Paul, we're really grateful to have had this time to visit with you. And with that, we'll say goodbye, and hope everyone listening gets a chance to read those books and grow spiritually as a result.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much. All right. We'll see you again another time. Goodbye.
Okay. Goodbye now.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.